Now, our presenters today, our keynote speakers today, don't speak directly or don't write directly to these trust gaps, but they offer us a way to understand the context that produces these challenges to trust. And they offer some hopeful strategies for how we might be able to navigate these challenges in teaching and learning. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Tricia Bertram Gallant. She's a prolific author and has recently published Academic Integrity in the Age of AI with Cambridge University Press. So welcome, Tricia. Natalie Curry-Toe, the editor of the recent collection, Reading the Room, which is available as an open access text. Welcome, Natalie. Our moderator for today is Dr. Sean Courage, and I will turn it over to you.
Natalie and Tricia, thank you for joining us. And Esther's going to join us as well for the conversation. We'll start with Tricia and then go to Natalie.
So trust, it's essential to my work. I have been a longstanding member with the International Center for Academic Integrity, and trust is one of the 6 fundamental values. So the definition of academic integrity, according to ICAI, is the courage to be honest, respectful, fair, responsible, and trustworthy, even when it's difficult to do so. So the very basis, the core of what I do is about trust. So how does that manifest? Well, first, faculty have to trust that we have a fair yet efficient process for helping them resolve concerns about when there's integrity concerns, when they're not sure if they can validate student learning or not, and they need to be able to trust that there's somebody that they can talk to that will handle this situation with honesty and, like I said, fairness. Otherwise, they'll ignore issues. And that doesn't work for our students, right? That think they're learning something that maybe they're not. And it doesn't, of course, help our value of our degrees or trust that society has them in the value of our degrees. I might do a little alliteration on our theme and say it closes doors and opens gaps if faculty ignore integrity concerns. Students, of course, have to trust us, because if they get sent to my office, they want to know, again, that it's going to be a fair and honest process, that we're not just going to go, cheater, right, and point at them and shame them. Sorry, Natalie, you were sitting right there. I didn't want to point at somebody in the audience. That wouldn't be nice. Right? They want to know that they can trust us to hear them as humans, to see them as humans, that they can walk in the door with dignity and that they'll be treated with respect, even if they violated academic integrity. So that's super important to us, that the students know this. Oh, and then that they trust any consequences that might ensue would be fair. And for me personally, it's one of the most important things for me that my actions and my words match, so that otherwise people can't trust me either. And my whole career now in academic integrity, which has been a couple of decades, has been built on that.
Thanks. Natalie?
I guess this is on automatically. Okay, great. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak with everyone today. I'm sad I missed yesterday, but I'm hoping to attend at least one session today before I have to head back to Montreal. So I come to this kind of area of work in a bit of a different framework. My area is in women, gender, and sexuality studies. I'm currently the principal of the Simone de Beauvoir Institute. When I started at Concordia, I was appointed as the first program director for a new sexuality program. And so pedagogy work in the kind of higher education context wasn't really my area of specialization or research until I ended up in this service role, where suddenly I had to implement a new major in a context where, we had 2 faculties, 5 departments. I was the only full-time faculty hired in sexuality studies. And there was, in that year of implementation, I consulted with students and part-time faculty and other faculty members teaching in the area. and discovered that, there are all these contradictions happening in the classroom that are a challenge for student learning, but also for faculty teaching, including anxieties around how to trust the classroom as a space where things like pronoun use or the anti-gender movement have kind of come to play in the ways in which gender and sexuality topics emerge, whether or not that's the focus of the course material. And so I started really trying to understand how to build a kind of capacity building and resilience building infrastructure to support the teaching and learning for students and faculty at the university in relation to sexuality and gender. And so I started working on what was supposed to be like a 3-page guide on pronoun use, and then became eventually an open educational resource guidebook called Better Practices in the Classroom. That's a set of summaries and insights into like a whole range of pedagogical topics that emerge and are grappled with in gender and sexuality classes. So that's a guidebook that's available online, free for people to use. And then, this area of work that I started to focus on in terms of gender and sexuality pedagogies became the focus increasingly of my research work more explicitly. And so I ended up working on a national study on trigger warnings in Canada with Michelle Miller, who's at OCAD, and Hannah Dyer, who's at Brock University. And then now I'm the PI on a national study on transformative experiences in the classroom called Transformative Encounters that looks at gender and sexuality classroom stories from people who are teaching and learning and engaging in experiential learning to understand what makes a transformative experience happen. So what are the things around it? So hopefully I'll have some positive insights to share at some point in the near future. But one of the things that I can say about trust in the context of trust is that some of the previous work I did on responses to war in the Middle East and the current work I've been doing in relation to gender and sexuality pedagogies came together after 2023, unsurprisingly, with the start of the genocide. And one of the things that I found was that my colleagues in other institutions and our students really struggled with feeling like they could trust the university as a space for engaging in political discussions and also learning in a context in which the larger geopolitical circumstances were at stake. And so over the last 3 years, I've been doing workshops with universities from mostly the kind of eastern side of North America, so some in Vermont and in Ontario and in Quebec, on navigating difficult pedagogical dynamics in the classroom that merge the kind of work I've been doing on gender and sexuality pedagogies and the kind of difficult learning environments that come from the trigger warning research with how to navigate the discussions around what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in the Congo, what's happening in Iran, and what's happening in Palestine. And so that kind of framework has, I think, introduced the question of trust not as an explicit topic that I speak to overtly, but it underlies, I think, a lot of the dynamics around what happens in those moments in which both teachers and students feel a fear around who they can trust, how they can trust, and in the context as well of the types of backlash that we see institutionally, there's also fear about being reported on, fear of being punished, fear of being censored, fear of things that lead people to self-censor, which I think is also antithetical to the learning space. So when students come into the classroom and feel like they can't speak at all, that's a real problem. And when teachers come into the classroom and feel like they have to walk on eggshells, that's also a problem. So I'm really interested in how to bring people back into a space where they can have really hard conversations, even if it's not meant to be the pedagogy of the classroom, but because those things come up now. And I'm hearing from colleagues that it's coming up in engineering classrooms. It's coming up in classrooms in programs that you wouldn't expect them to come up in class topics where you wouldn't expect it. Because students and faculty are being impacted by what's going on in the world more broadly. I think one of the things that that the last few years have really shown me is that there are geopolitical and ideological and ethical kind of considerations that inform some of the encounters that happen in the classroom. But across the board, I think that especially the research on trigger warnings showed me is that regardless of the topical or the area focus of the concern that emerges in those types of encounters, that the common thread across them is that the people who are responsible for managing the classroom, so faculty members or teaching assistants, because we had a lot of teaching assistants who filled out our survey, is a concern and fear over their own ability to trust themselves to manage difficult encounters or things that come up unexpectedly. I mean, the research on trigger warnings really shows that that the trigger warning itself doesn't really do actually that much. And so the trigger warning, if it's not accompanied with a bunch of other scaffolding and pedagogical practices, can actually elicit the same response from students as not giving a trigger warning. And so the research really, in our study at least, illustrates that kind of the debate about trigger warnings misidentifies the problem. Like, it focuses on this topic for debate rather than the issue of what actually happens in the classroom is that teachers feel anxious about how to handle an unexpected, difficult encounter, and students feel anxious about their ability to trust their peers and their teachers in effectively managing emotions in the classroom. And so I think that that dynamic speaks across areas, across topics, and can speak to, the experience or example that you've given, Esther, of the situation around treatment of animals in the kind of veterinary sciences, which is how do we manage and navigate something that is not part of the planned pedagogy in the classroom. I mean, it's easier when it's planned, because if you plan it in advance, then you can build across the semester, preparatory discussions, material, you can create a framework. The kind of scaffolding that you can build is really effective at preparing for those conversations. But it's the unexpected ones, the ones that happen out of the blue in the classroom in a discussion. Someone comes in and something just happened in the news, or, and it could be something that like a puppy mill was just like announced in the news. I mean, that happens all the time in Quebec, so I'm sure it happens here too. And that might bring up a lot of emotions for people. And the idea here, I think, is that in general, higher education has presumed that emotions aren't really the center of the educational experience. So we have to intellectualize things. This is a space for ideas. It's a space for knowledge. But really what we're seeing in the world is a shift in the larger context in which it's really hard for people, I think, to live as emotionless in all aspects of their life, especially in education. And people have an emotional relationship to what they learn. So the fact that none of us are trained to be, emotional managers of a classroom space makes it incredibly challenging to enter into an encounter where emotions might be heightened. And so how that takes place, there might be people who have an intuitive relationship that is incredibly, they're adept at responding to and holding space for hard emotions that might emerge in an educational environment. But for the most part, that's not something we're trained in. That's not something we have a lot of practice in. And that space of response is, I think, really where the trust rupture happens. So when someone responds in a way that is defensive, or someone asserts authority, or someone's dismissive or mocks another person, that's the place where I think the trust really ruptures. And from the trigger warning research, one of the things that we really were surprised by and that we were excited about was that students actually wanted the classroom to be a space where hard conversations could happen. And they had a lot of patience, actually, for an understanding for like people saying the wrong thing. And they were mostly afraid that if they said the wrong thing, that something bad would happen to them. And they also felt really betrayed when something got out of hand in the classroom, and they felt the teacher didn't do a good job of bringing that back together, bringing the classroom back together in a way. And so I think that trust really lies at the core of that relationship. And so I think the question of trust really needs emotion as a piece of that conversation in order to think across different topical fields. And it could be about gender. It could be about, experiences of racism. It could be about animal cruelty. It could be about our geopolitical views, just like in terms of elections coming up, or in terms of environmental issues that are affecting people in their daily lives, or that are threatening to affect people. These are all things that people are grappling with and that are in their heads all day. I mean, they're in my head all day also. So I understand it.
you said one thing I was going to add, which was the training piece. So it's to your point about, people used to come to us because we were the holders of all knowledge and information back in the 18th, 19th, 20th century, right? Or 19th, 20th centuries. You literally had to come to university to get access to knowledge and information, right?
Mhm.
That's not what we are anymore. And yet we've maintained that, personality trait. And there is no such thing as, finally we start to think about emotional intelligence, but still. So we've still focused on disciplinary knowledge, right? And training people in disciplinary knowledge. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. What I'm saying is that we have not been good at teaching people durable human skills. This is why the self-help section of the bookstore is so big, because we never were taught how to hold crucial conversations, how to have difficult conversations, how to manage emotions of my own and my others. And so this is the whole self-help industry trying to fill the gaps that K through 16 had failed to do for folks. And I think that if we want to regain trust and be able to have these conversations, it's not so much about teaching teachers how to manage that classroom, but it's embedding building in people durable human skills that would enable them to have that in the first place. So I think that's really important. And I think the second thing that in the age of AI that's adding to this is now with the B bracelet or the Meta glasses or even our smartphones, but more so with the wearables, there's this constant fear of being recorded. And so when we do our after education program with students who have violated academic integrity, we call it the ethics lab. So if I say that, you'll know what I'm talking about. We say, put your phones away, because we're having crucial conversations here, personal conversations, difficult conversations about ethics. And even if you're not recording somebody, the phone out there sends a symbol that you might be tweeting about. They don't tweet, but you know what I mean. Whatever they do about them or recording it or whatever. And so to show your respect for your fellow humans in the room, and to show your presence for them, you're going to put your devices away. And so there's a resurgence right now of device-free classrooms to try and, I think, us to rebuild that psychological safety for being able to say something and not have it, go on in perpetuity and out of context is what most people are afraid of, I think. We're not helping people develop the skills they need to be good professionals and good citizens. So we keep universities, it's particularly universities, we keep chasing the job market, right? And let's be frank, we've never been good at it. We've never really been good at it. And if we think we can chase the AI job market, if we think we can create something now for first-year students that will prepare them for the jobs they'll graduate into 3 years from now, that's ridiculous. We have no idea. We've never known how the workplace is going to change. We definitely don't know what AI is going to do to the workplace. And so I think people have lost their trust in us because we keep promising things we fail to deliver. I think that people lost trust in us because we don't offer relevant, meaningful experiences. Like we don't do enough experiential learning. We don't do enough co-op and internships and apprenticeships and all of that type of thing. And we keep scaling up our classes. I don't know, how many does this fit? No, it's a fairly small classroom. What,
226, it says on the wall over there.
How do you build trusting relationships with your fellow students and your professor when you're one of 226? I mean, at least I can make eye contact with people, but I'm not going to know their names, right? Like, how are they supposed to feel seen in a room like this when there's not possible for me to know their names? And we do that because university is expensive. We got to have more students. We also do it for access. So we try and do it for good reasons too. But then we need more money because we have more students and we need more professors, but we don't get enough professors. So I think this idea that, I mean, in America, colleges and universities have been shutting down. And we're seeing more and more employers say bachelor's degree no longer required. And it's because we have failed to deliver on our promise, which was always developing the next generation of ethical professionals and citizens. And we've been scared away from the ethical part because we're scared of that being difficult conversations. And we've driven ourselves away from the citizen part. And we keep chasing that profession part. And so I think if we want to, well, this is a later question for rebuilding that trust, but I think that's part of the trust gap. And of course, now AI, I mean, there's no, you can't trust the products that used to be artifacts of learning. Students can't trust that faculty are doing their jobs. They think they're using AI. And it's just a big black box of non-interpretability.
Natalie?
I think there may be two or probably three, maybe even more different kinds of reasons why trust feels so fragile right now in higher education. I mean, I think first is what I already spoke to, which is what's happening in the classroom itself, that there is, I think, a large sense of betrayal about what is going on in classrooms when things fall apart and there isn't work done to repair that the kind of ruptures or breakdown that might happen in the classroom. And I think that's the key part here, is that, you know, it's normal for things to kind of fall apart in a learning context. Learning is hard. It's a challenge, not just in terms of the work and labor of doing teaching and learning, but also, you know, in order to learn something that you don't already know, and this is like the psychoanalytic work in education, is you have to like come to a place in which you can accept that you don't know what you think you already know, and you have to be willing to suspend the comfort of what knowledge is available already to you in order to learn something different, to engage with something different, to have new ideas enter into your frame of reference that might change and transform you in some way that can make you foreign to yourself in a way also. So that's a risky endeavor to ask students to engage in, and in the face of other people and evaluation happening at the same time. So all of that is already tricky. That is going on in the kind of the immediate interactive space of the classroom. But I think in the larger context of higher education, we're seeing, I think, also another shift that's happening in terms of how institutions are managing trust issues. And I think one of those is how universities and colleges have responded to external pressure around geopolitical issues, not only in relation to the social movements that have emerged on campuses in relation to, for example, genocide, but also to political pressure. So how are institutions responding to the political pressure of politicians, to public debate? And what we're seeing is, I think, a rupture in the trust between administrations and faculty and students at universities when administrations choose punitive models or approaches to those questions. And so, you know, there has been over the last 3 years an increasing focus on punitive approaches, including hiring private security consultants, introducing policies that restrict political speech on campuses. And all of those gestures have an impact on people's ability to trust the university. The space of the university that placed academic freedom and intellectual debate at the center and core of learning and its role and mission has been eroded. Academic freedom is under actual threat, and people have lost their jobs. Teachers have lost their jobs, but staff members have lost their jobs. Students have lost their standing in university. There are hundreds of cases of students who were either suspended or expelled from school over the last 3 years through their participation in social movements on campuses. And those policy changes have significant impacts on people's ability to trust the institution as a space that can contain and hold complex debate in any way, shape, or form. And so the repercussions of that shift have meant that the language and I guess larger context that's shaping higher education, even if an institution hasn't implemented those policy changes, the fact that the ecosystem of higher education has adopted those things makes people feel anxious and afraid. And anxiety that has heightened escalates other emotions in the classroom and in a learning environment. So being afraid that, you know, if you say the wrong thing, you could get fired, that you could be expelled from school, that you could be suspended, that a complaint made against you could lead to an investigation that leads to you being suspended or expelled, is terrifying. It's a really frightening prospect, and it's continuing to happen. There are 4 cases of students who are facing suspension right now for activities they engaged in 3 years ago in Montreal, and that's 3 years later, institutions are pursuing punitive measures. And so instead of thinking about the kind of trust breakdown as something in which the institution has lost its trust in its students to, for example, follow the rules or follow its policies, what we're really seeing, I think, is is just a breakdown in the way in which higher education has grappled with challenging dynamics by, I think, trying to enforce an authoritative model that is not actually conducive to learning. And I think that that's one of the biggest challenges that higher education is going to be facing right now and in the future, is how to navigate a circumstance or a condition of higher education or the educational experience in which there is going to be rapid changes, where the economic situation is going to increase precarity in the student body, in which the geopolitical circumstances are going to continue to escalate, in which now we're also anticipating resource shortages are going to be impacting education as well in the coming months, in fact. And so all of those things create an unstable environment that our institutions really need to be more adept at like actually filling the gaps for, rather than trying to contain them or expel them from the institutional setting. And I don't just mean like expelling students, but actually like making the problem something that's offloaded. At my institution, they've gotten rid of tons of resources because of austerity measures that help students and help faculty members. For example, note takers are gone now. We don't have note takers anymore. Universities are encouraging us to make note taking a class assignment, so that or introducing generative AI to create notes for students with accessibility needs in the classroom. And so these strategies and approaches that are not negotiated with faculty members and students, that are implemented by upper administration because they're cost effective, and they offload responsibility onto instructors and students in the classroom, are going to have wide scale repercussions for not only learning, but also trust in the educational setting more broadly.
What we want to do is continue challenging the very conditions that have shaped our work. How do we start doing that in the classroom? And how do we do that through offices like the Academic Integrity Office or the Testing Center?
I am glad, Esther, that you used the words values intention, because I had already written that down when Natalie was speaking. I talk about tension and values a lot. Rushworth Kidder, who is an ethicist, wrote the book, How Good People Make Tough Decisions. And he talks about how we often miscategorize things as ethical dilemmas. So when we do things, we see values in tension, we see them as a dilemma, and we have to choose one over the other. So we might have to choose free speech over psychological or physical safety, right? We may have to choose access versus integrity when we talk about online asynchronous classes. We might have to choose learning over efficiency, or efficiency over learning when it comes to artificial intelligence. And so we see these in tension, and we think, one, we have to resolve that tension because we don't like tension. And two, we think that we have to choose one over the other to resolve it. But really, Rushworth Kidder would say, maybe it's a trilemma. Maybe there's a third solution that could uphold both values, maybe not perfectly, maybe not easily, but maybe there's a third solution that doesn't require you to use a horrible, I guess, phrase, throw the baby out with the bathwater. A horrible phrase. Anyways, so I think we have to communicate our values, and then and not shy away from addressing them when they're in tension, to your point. And so, because I think there's a way for us to uphold all of those values. And I think there's a way in which the universities should be leaders in doing that. And we should be able to speak to it to say, look, we know that for students, from an academic integrity perspective, we know that being a student today is hard. We know that many of you are working lots of hours. Maybe you're also caregiving for people in your life. Maybe you're trying to do school full time. And AI is a really enticing way to reduce some of the stress in your life, to make things more efficient. However, learning is not about efficiency. And so let's use it in ways that will help you be efficient, but not use it in other ways that will minimize your learning. So I think we have to communicate those values and help students and ourselves see when they're in tension and figure out how to resolve that tension. I also think that we have to be honest with ourselves about human fallibility. I often hear, when I go around talking to faculty, I often hear them say, I just want to trust my students. What they mean is they want to keep giving the same assignments they've been giving, for the last 20 years, and just trust their students won't use AI on them. And I think that is unfair. And I think it's a dereliction of duty. I think it's unfair to say, particularly to 17 to 21-year-olds or even younger, just don't use it. And I trust you, because it creates an unfair environment. And it really denies students their humanity. And most humans will look for shortcuts, right? Most humans will look for shortcuts. And most students are using AI when they use it to quote unquote cheat. They're not using it because they're cheaters, right? They're horrible people who are just trying to cheat their way through school. There's a few of those, but not many. They're doing it because they're trying to resolve a tension. And so I think we shouldn't bemoan that we can't trust students with AI. And I think we should acknowledge, look, these products are designed to be addictive. They're designed to entice this kind of behavior, and we have to work to counter it. Again, it's not about not trusting our students, but it's about saying we value learning. We know there's also value in efficiency. How can we learn to resolve that tension? What can we do to resolve that tension? So I think we just have to be more honest with ourselves, and be honest with this desire that we have to almost take away people's humanity by saying we trust you. Like I trust myself, except when it comes to that bag of Lay's potato chips sitting on my counter. I don't trust myself at all, right? That doesn't mean I'm a horrible person. It does mean I'm going to clear the kitchen of the Lay's potato chips. So I think, Esther, it's so important for us just to consider what values our intention in our classroom. How can we have an open and honest dialogue with our students about it? And how can we say, look, I trust you, and I also understand you're under a lot of pressure and stress, so here are the things I'm going to do for you to create an environment where you're not constantly fighting that temptation to offload. So I'm going to say, let's put our devices away, right? I'm going to say, let's do some writing in class on paper without your devices or whatever, with accessibility issues, accessibility in mind. But just seeing it as a gift to people, to give them, to be honest with them, to say, I trust that you're human. This is going to be tempting. So let's take those temptations away for 30 minutes so we can concentrate on learning.
I read The Opposite of Cheating earlier this year, academic year. And I thought one of the most valuable pieces of advice in that book for navigating, which seems so simple, and I guess I hadn't really thought about it, is have an explicit conversation with your students about ethics from a disciplinary perspective as an entry point to talking about trust and behavior in your class. And it, as I was reading, I was sort of realizing that, like, I actually don't know how often I do that.
Yeah. Well, you could do it from a disciplinary perspective. You could just do it. The other example we give in the book is just those 6 fundamental values of academic integrity: courage, honesty, respect, responsibility, fairness, and trustworthiness. And how students have a conversation with the students have a conversation with each other. What behaviors would we exhibit to uphold those values? What behaviors do we want the instructor or the instructional team to do to uphold those values? And that having that conversation, the students are going to say the same things you are. Come to class prepared. Don't give the prompt to ChatGPT to do the essay for you. Like, they're going to say all those things, but when students hear it from each other, they're like, oh, I actually share the same values as my peers. I think they're all, cheaters who are just going to cheat, but they actually want the same thing I do. And so maybe I'll resist that temptation a bit more, because now I'm not only going to disappoint my teacher, but my fellow students, or betray their trust.
Yeah, I mean, I don't work in the area of AI or academic integrity, but just in terms of my in terms of my own experience in my own classroom, I can say that I teach an experiential learning class that prepares students to do an experiential learning placement in a community organization. And last fall, I was on sabbatical. Like the AI situation, really, I'm revealing my own failure to be able to properly grasp this. But I was on sabbatical for the year where AI really took hold of the classroom. And then I came back in last fall, and I was shocked that my students used AI we did the ethical discussions. We talked about it in so many different ways. The course looked at all of these different ethical considerations around experiential learning and community placement and university partnerships, and also AI use. And so many of my students used AI to create their community projects. And I was really shocked about it. And one of the things that I think is happening is also that there's a loss of trust in the purpose of the degree, that the function of the degree has lost its value in our society, that there's a social devaluation of higher education more broadly, and also a gamification of every aspect of people's lives. I mean, I'm gamifying myself also, like using Duolingo for whatever, like chess learning. But I think that larger context makes it really challenging for students and teachers to figure out how to restructure the relationship between learning. And I'm saying this to admit that I don't know. Like I'm still trying to figure it out. But I do think that you're right, Tricia, that there is something about the collaborative relationship of like navigating things with each other. And I think experiential learning is a place where that may be possible. But at the core, one of the things that I've really grappled with, and I think, Esther, you're trying to signal a little bit, is that, because you came to that talk where I spoke about this, is what I think of as ways of building capacity for people to not only withstand something that is difficult and like survive it and work through it in some way, but also to hold contradiction. And the language that I've used previously is like a coalitional model of the classroom, but it doesn't have to be that. It could be anything, any framework that you might want to use where you're building capacity to actually like navigate something in which you don't have to resolve the problem at hand fully. You just have to come to a place where you can find a common ground for the thing to bring people together in the classroom environment. So like a coalitional model in this way is that you have a group of people in the classroom, for example, who have different standpoints and different perspectives and experiences. They live in different experiential and historical contexts that they bring with them into the classroom. The goal of the classroom isn't to make everyone agree with each other on the experiences that people are sharing. The goal of the classroom is a place where people can engage with discussions in which those differences come to the forefront, but that you find an anchor to hold the class together in a way that people can agree on, that is a shared goal, that's a good enough goal to get you through that class or that semester or that year. And in a coalitional model, the relationships of collaboration between groups or people are not permanent. They don't have to be universal. They don't have to require you to engage with people that you're close to. In the kind of like women of color feminist frameworks of coalitional building, Bernice Reagan Johnson, in a famous speech that is published in this collection organized by some of the people from the Combahee River Collective, shared that, to do coalition effectively, you have to be in coalition with people who in another context could potentially kill you. And that's like the political language of, as a Black lesbian feminist, she was talking about in a moment in which, women's liberation, gay liberation, and Black liberation, life and death was on the line for a lot of people who were organizing and activists. People were being assassinated. And so in that context, being able to work with people who in another context might be your opponent was really important and key for feminist movements or for lesbian movements or for Black liberation movements. And so in that kind of way of thinking about the classroom, obviously the stakes are a little bit different, but the idea that you don't need to come to a universal or homogenous way of thinking about a situation, but rather you find an anchor that can direct everyone's attention and energy towards that anchor that's shared in some way, which could be a reading or an assignment or an activity or another purpose or function, and then orient the ways in which people come differently to those conversations in a way that strengthens that common goal in some framework. And in this sense, building coalitional capacity is about building people's capacity to suspend the need to resolve every tension, to be able to express difference and articulate that difference, to have disagreement and hold the capacity to maintain a disagreement across a class or a semester, and also to be able to center accountability and respect for one another within those interactions. Because the key here is that students don't want to, and also teachers don't want to feel like topics are being avoided. And our impulse when something is really hard is either to like double down on our defensive-ness or our authority. We're not talking about this isn't going to happen, or to avoid it, or this is how it is because I'm the expert in this area. I like doing that one a lot. I know gender. Yeah. That's a joke. I don't do that with my students. They know more than I do actually about gender. But the other side of that is avoidance. And the avoidance is a slow erosion of trust in education. Because the more we avoid something hard, the more we become avoidant of that hard thing. And I think often about a friend of mine who told me that she uses AI only to write hard emails. And that really struck me. If my students, or if I'm as a teacher using a technology to avoid something hard, the more I'm avoiding that hard thing, the more averse to doing that hard thing I'm gonna be. It's gonna be harder and harder to do those things. So how can we make the classroom a space where we actually get practice doing hard things, where we have hard conversations, where we are capable of working with each other across things that are difficult to hold space for? And that's something that comes only through building across a semester. It comes through building that culture in your departments and with your peers. And I think that's where, thinking about this as an isolated situation, like it's only about my classroom or it's only about university policy, really fails us. And this is where I think thinking about our departments as coalitions is important too. Thinking about what we work with our peers and our units around it, in our faculties, and how we also advocate within our institutions. And building that capacity, I think, will go a lot further for helping us hold that space in our departments and programs and our classrooms than simply having a policy. Like the policies are not doing much other than to protect the institution and to set up the benchmark for what rules are being followed or not followed. And we need practice changes so that people aren't falling back into repeat offenses of academic integrity violations.
So when we got on the panel talk or discussion call, I think Esther was like, okay, so Natalie and Tricia are coming from two totally different worlds here. This should be interesting. And Natalie and I realized how much we have in common coming from these two totally different worlds. So I just wanted to echo what you were saying there. One of the things I've been talking about is right now is a time for human agency, right? To enliven the agency of ourselves, first of all, because a lot of us are feeling helpless and hapless when it comes to the genie being let out of the bottle by these Gen AI companies, right? It's like, what did they say to us? Well, the students are using it anyway, so you got to figure it out. You got to redesign all your assessments, and you got to teach them how to use it, and it's up to you to figure. And the LMSs are telling us it's up to you to block. We can't block the AI agents. You have to figure everything out. And so individual faculty shoulders are getting heavier and heavier with this burden of figuring this all out. And so, yes, we have some individual agency in our courses to try and make some changes. But your point about departments is one I've been making. That sense of collective agency as a department. How are we going to approach teaching and learning in the age of AI? How are we going to build this capacity to empower humans to have human-to-human learning experiences, to really embrace and build those durable human skills over the course of the students' time with us, for those at least that are in our major. But then as a collective, as a TMU collective, you have a lot of agency. As professors across Canada, you have a lot of agency. As citizens, we have a lot of agency to demand more. And so I really like that you're using the word coalition, I'm using, collective agency building. But it's the same thing that I think too often as humans, one thing we've noticed, and it's partly from AI, but partly from the stamping down of agency by institutions, political mostly, that we are becoming more and more hapless and helpless. And I think we have to shake that off and remember that humans have always managed to pull something out of the hat and face difficult things and come out hopefully stronger in the end.
I think that's a great question. I think unpacking is an incredibly effective and helpful pedagogical tool, especially like if you have a text or an object or a topic that is already loaded in some way, and then what you're doing is trying to find different entry points into that text or object. You're trying to identify the different facets of those discussions. It's a really good critical thinking tool for students that can help them position ideas in relation to what happens in relation to the object or topic that you're discussing in class, or that's in relation to an assignment that they're doing. And I think that like the complementary relationship, that like the kind of pedagogical strategies I'm proposing are like the preparation work that you do before that unpacking. So for example, like I use the word scaffolding a lot because I like the metaphor. I think it's helpful because you can like build it to the scale of what you want to do. It's about building good foundations and then like practicing those things and preparation that acclimates people to being able to have and do something hard. And so like I think the combination of like the preparation work that goes into something that is going to be challenging or difficult, and then also the work of how to enter into an object or topic that seems coherent, and then taking it apart to understand the different components of it is really effective. And what I like to do with my students, and like this hasn't been such an issue right now in my current role because I'm in a department in a university that's kind of like edgy and avant-garde with gender politics. But I was in the U.S. previously at the University of Pittsburgh. You know, I had students who were like, you know, they called me socialist as a derogatory term and stuff like that. You know, people who were in the classroom to oppose me. Like
now it's a compliment at Concordia?
I mean, it's, you know, I think it's actually an insult at Concordia too, to be honest. But I never had encountered that before. And so the thing that I think it was a helpful approach was instead of to try and convince the student that he was wrong or that what he was doing was, you know, inappropriate because it countered the framework or narrative in the class, you know, I use that kind of an unpacking approach to ask him to like, you know, come into the text or the object that we were talking about from his framework. Okay. So like this text is talking about gender in this particular way. Your approach has a different framework. So like engage with the text. What are the components that are in disagreement? And then, you know, like whether it strengthens his own particular worldview or not, kind of doesn't really, it's not my role to change his opinion about and his beliefs, but I think my role was to, in that situation, help him engage in a text that he didn't agree with in a way that was constructive to his learning. And so I think of that often as a way of entering into text. And I think about it also for my student who comes in the classroom who's like, I know everything about gender. I don't need to learn anything from this class because I'll teach you what you don't know. And so that student also needs help. Like the student who is a native like knowledge producer from being themselves the subject of the material in the classroom needs support and help to come into a text that might change their own perceived existing knowledge. And I think in some ways that other student is really harder to do that work with because there is the authority that comes from experience that can be really hard to introduce a narrative or a worldview that might challenge that in some way too. So I think the goal isn't to try and break our students of their positions or beliefs, but to help them feel comfortable having an uncomfortable experience with a text or an object or discussion in class that doesn't force them to change their perspective or position, but has them engage with it. And in the process of that engagement, their position might change or it might not. It might reinforce something that they already believe and strengthen their views in a value that might not be something that they want to give up. And I don't know if that's necessarily a horrible thing for a classroom to leave students with, you know, especially if that strengthens a relationship to a value that isn't just based on, well, because I believe it. And so I think that pedagogically, those are effective strategies.
Well, first, thank you for teaching a very hard, difficult subject matter in healthcare. I've always said when people are like, wow, your job's hard, I don't do medical ethics, so it's not that hard. So thank you for that. I love everything you said. I would say we failed that student who doesn't change their belief if we've also failed to help them articulate why they hold that belief and engage in conversations with folks who might have different beliefs than that. So that's where I think we might fail. So in our ethics lab, we have students list out their top 5 core ethical values, but then we also have them do a values map. And so they think about, how does that value manifest for me in my academic life, if I have a job, in my workplace, if I, my family life, or with my friends, so they can start to articulate what honesty means or looks like. Or frankly, if honesty and respect come up in tension, how do I resolve that tension? Because our goal is to help students, in Mary Gentle's words, give voice to values, right? And to be able, when they go out into the world, or even in the classroom, but eventually out to the world, be able to articulate that and engage with other people who have a different viewpoint in a professional, collegial, community of practice way. Because whether I'm speaking with a bunch of other nurses or speaking with a bunch of other doctors, or it's a mixed disciplinary team, I've got to be able to say, I've got to understand. I got to have some metacognition, right? Like, I've got to understand why I think this, then be able to articulate the why, and then to be able to hear other people's point of views. And if we're in tension, figure out how we can either work in that tension or resolve that tension. This is a current problem that's going to get that's on steroids now, and will continue to get exacerbated by AI, because mis and disinformation will be able to spread much more quickly than it ever has in the past, and it already is, and it's going to get worse. This gets back to our job. Our core job probably is critical thinking, right? If we think about all the durable human skills that children and young adults should be developing, critical thinking is our genre. It's our it's our thing. And yet, we've called those soft skills, we've called those transferable skills in the past, and they've always been part of our not always. For the most part, they're part of our hidden curriculum. Oh, our students know how to work with others because we threw them into groups. It's like, well, did you teach them how to work in groups? No, they figured it out, right? It's always been through osmosis or through unstructured experiential learning without any really assessment of it. So I would say a critical thinking is going to save us from, if y'all seen the Idiocracy movie from a while ago, it's going to save us from that eventually, but we're not going to be able to stop the slop. We have to teach people how to discern slop from fact.
Yeah, I think, the critical thinking is 100% key here. And also, fact checking, like those kinds of skills that are, research skills, but that are yeah, exactly, that are even more pronounced in this moment are necessary. But the other thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately is really informed by the kind of critical scholarship that's coming out of things like Afrofabulation, Indigenous resurgence, critical disability studies, which is world making. And, in a context where students and also, faculty members, people within our society are feeling more and more hopeless about the world that we live in and the future, exercises of imaginative thinking about what it would be like, or what it would mean, or what it would do to create a world or a version of things that is, the ideal, the utopian, turning to those kinds of ways of thinking require a kind of critical thinking skill set and imaginative skill set that I think is something that is incredibly helpful and useful in this moment. So if you don't believe and trust information anymore, okay, we can find ways of figuring out how to separate fact from fiction, but how do we get people to have resilience in the face of that, onslaught of slop that they're being confronted with? Well, it could be through creation, and that practice of creating and envisioning what things could be different doesn't have to be about imagining a new world. It could just be about creating or imagining a new approach to that technology or that material or that context, So if students are, for example, trying to find information on community experiences of, using public transportation, and AI slop has kind of filled the void of whatever research that's been done recently on this, instead of just trying to find the facts on what actually is occurring in terms of usage by looking at the data, you could have that accompanied by an assignment that asks people to envision what a fully integrated public transit system could look like. How would you feel in a public transit system like that? What would be the factors spatially that would make you feel that way? Who would be in that space that would make you feel like it was an effective inclusive space, or, you know, like doing those kinds of reflexive exercises that ask us to think creatively, I think could be one of the responses that we could build.
Okay,
Uh,
great.
Hi,
There we go.
I'm Alex. Natalie, you mentioned that you're doing some research on transformative classrooms, right? Any preliminary data or findings that you could share with us?
Well, I mean, the study itself was inspired by this book that I edited called Reading the Room, and it's 25 chapters with students, like undergraduate, graduate students, faculty members who are junior and senior faculty members from across Canada who are reflecting on their classroom experiences. And that editing that book really inspired me to think about, like I'd been doing all this research on like the challenging things that are happening in the classroom. And then I was like, you know what? There's something that is incredibly empowering about the way that people in my field are thinking about what they do in their teaching environments that is really profound. And like a transformative experience was something that a lot of people talked about in their writing. And I realized that no one had done research on this. Like no one had documented or studied how people like feel some kind of transformation in their learning experience, even though this is like a very common experience for people in gender and sexuality classrooms. I don't know about other fields, probably it happens, but especially in women and gender studies, every person I've ever spoken to who's ever done women and gender studies has had like a moment where everything changed for them. Like their whole world changed, their worldview changed, their experience in the world changed, their feelings about themselves changed, maybe their relationship to their identity changed. And so we're only at the early stages of this. So I don't have, interviews start actually this week. My first interview I have 2 interviews on Thursday, and then next week I've got a few more. So hopefully we'll have some data by this time next year. But I don't have anything concrete to tell you other than the kind of anecdotal observations that I have from this edited collection that I have, and that, through my own interactions with my students, which is that I think that there's something about learning that has a personal stake in it, when you're learning about something that you have a personal stake in, but that also invites you into thinking through multiple perspectives about that topic, opens possibility in a way that most other forms of learning where you're just like processing like a set of content that you have to regurgitate doesn't allow for. And so being able to not only learn about one topic from one framework, but multiple frameworks is, I think, incredibly powerful. And there's something about the kind of like the contradictions and infighting that happens in feminist scholarship and in gender studies as a field more broadly that I think really creates an environment where that is facilitated. And I think other fields have it too. I don't have expertise in those fields.
I think part of what Natalie just said, people need to find it relevant and meaningful. That doesn't mean we don't teach content anymore, right? It doesn't mean that people don't build disciplinary or subject matter expertise. That is absolutely necessary for it to be able to effectively, intellectually, ethically use AI. Otherwise, you can't critically interpret the output that it's giving you, right? So you definitely need subject matter expertise, and we should keep doing that. I think the way in which we do that should change more to a mastery-based approach. There are certain resources that instructors need to make that happen, but you can even teach, physics, chemistry, math in meaningful, relevant ways. So it's not that is not the purview alone of humanities and social sciences. So I think that's the first thing. How do we update our pedagogies and the way in which we approach these things for the 21st century? I think we also have to do so that's facilitating learning, and I think we also have to do a better job of validating learning. I think we have relied again on certain things that aren't relevant anymore. So we are still teaching according to the 1906 Carnegie Credit Hour. We think that people learn after 120 credits or whatever it is. We think, how long is this semester here at TMU?
We kind of started at the beginning, and then when it gets close to the end, you kind of feel it.
But
12 weeks though.
Weeks, yeah. So here it's 12 weeks. Some institutions it's 14 weeks, some it's 15, some it's 16. At ours, we're a quarter system, so ours are 10 weeks. There's no pedagogical learning science basis for these time limits whatsoever. right? And so I think we need to switch. We got to really start thinking about 21st century models, which might include competency-based education. All of these things are really focused on learning rather than in butts in seat time, as if that equates with learning. And we know students aren't putting their butts in the seats for all that time anyway. So, and then validating learning. It's not just about, and this isn't about, failing students or passing students. This is about helping students understand, have I achieved the level of mastery I was hoping to yet? And if I haven't, we give them more chances to do that. So I just think we need to fundamentally shift, and this is a big job, and individual faculty can't do this, but collectively faculty can advocate for this, where we shift into a true 21st century mindset where learning is not time or place dependent. And yet, we do provide a very unique experience of human-to-human learning experiences that I think we need to triple down on and embrace, and not see it as inconvenience, but as something that's fundamental to learning, because there's a lot more friction in engaging with other humans than there is engaging with AI. And if we just move towards fully computerized AI learning, we'll have lost a big part of our humanity.
I think one of the things that we are struggling with today is the legacy of education's role as a function of like social normalization and also discipline. Yeah, and disciplining people into becoming subjects who are capable of working at jobs that are in demand or needed. And one of the aspects of that is that there's a kind of punitive lineage of the history of education that permeates the contemporary classroom, which is, we still have an evaluation schema that fails students, that we have a punitive approach when students fail too many classes or have a low GPA. We have a punitive approach when students don't submit their assignments on time, which is like grade docking. We have a punitive approach. Yeah, exactly. And then we have a punitive approach for students who miss classes and for who violate academic integrity, as Tricia has discussed already. And I think that punitive framework and the way in which we are asked as instructors and teachers to enforce a punitive model in learning is really antithetical to our ability to actually grapple with the things that are needed for the contemporary classroom. And I think that the things that we actually need are capacity to repair. So the ability to trust that when something falls apart or breaks down or something's ruptured, that we can move from that we can move beyond it, that we can heal from it, requires repair. You have to be able to repair the damage that's done. And that's the skill that I think that we're really lacking. And that I also am struggling to learn how to adopt that and establish it, especially now in my new role as a unit head in my department, how to take on that different framework and how to build accountability in a way that is not just about punishment, but actually about like how to make sense of the circumstances, the different positioning, the impacts of different power relations that shape experiences that people have in their interactions in the learning space. And so that's, I think, maybe where I would ask institutions to develop better skills at building reparative capacity within the institutional setting and abandoning the punitive approaches that we've been kind of indoctrinated into without good reason and that aren't really helpful for us. To do that requires a lot of work. I mean, being able to do repair work takes time and training and experience, and it takes also clumsiness, vulnerability. It means making mistakes, having patience. And so all of those are skills that I think we're going to all need a lot more of, not only in higher education, but for the world that we're facing right now.